Welcome to Reclaiming the Faith with Phil Baker, a podcast with a mission to reveal what the earliest Christians believed about the core issues facing us today. You can find links to all of Phil's resources at philsbaker.com. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen today, and take a moment to share this podcast with your friends. Now, here's Phil.
Hey guys, this is episode 109. It's my interview with Dr. Judd Burton on the origin and significance of the Apocrypha, and I am just very excited for y'all to hear that. I'm also super pumped for y'all to be able to hear another preview of song number 1 off my upcoming EP called Genesis. So this is a song called The Greater Man.
Take a deep breath as my heart starts beating. Listen as the King calls out my name. Taste and see of the good things He has made. Go to sleep and wake up to His wonder. I wasn't meant to do this on my own. I could never dream of the beauty He has shown me. How could I begin to doubt your goodness, and who am I to question your great love? How could I have listened to deception? My God, what have I done? Even still you cover me with mercy. Even still you carry out your plan, and faith we wait for the day of the greater man. See my baby boy and then his...
All right, so like I said, that was a song called The Greater Man, which is off my upcoming EP, Genesis. Look for it sometime in the early fall, along with the book that I'm writing called Faithful Witness, The Early Church's Theology of Martyrdom. Yeah, so be on the lookout for that. It'll be sold most likely on Amazon. There'll be audio versions, Kindle versions, and print-on-demand versions as well of that book. Please be in prayer for both of those projects as they are getting wrapped up. Also, please go check out Dr. Burton's websites, burtonbeyond.com and tioba.org. For more information about the many amazing courses Dr. Burton is offering, special prices going on, so go check that out. Also, he has many books you can find that he's published there. Just so much incredible information from Dr. Burton, so please go check that out, along with a course on the Apocrypha, which we're talking about today. Finally, I am blessed to be a part of Omega Frequency, along with Kurt and BDK, who are putting out great content every week. Go to the YouTube channels Omega Frequency and Omega Frequency Live. Become a subscriber there and hit the bell so that you'll be notified when a new show goes up. You will not be disappointed. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into my interview with Dr. Judd Burton on the Apocrypha. Well, Dr. Judd Burton, thank you again for coming on Reclaiming the Faith, man. This is it's just a privilege for me to have you on every time.
My pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, can you let people know a little bit about what you've been working on and what you have coming down the pike?
Sure. Of course, the lion's share of my work now is to the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, and I've developed new course programs, certification programs. Your listeners will probably be familiar with the ones that I had the last time we spoke, which basically consisted of biblical anthropology, biblical demonology, and I think that preternatural morphology had been out for maybe a month at that point. That's really become the hot topic. You know, lots of people signing up for that. That's the Monsters 101 class, basically, looking at the vampires and werewolves and chimera and those kinds of things through the lens of the Bible. And I've developed new ones. I've got a new mythology course. It's basically a survey of world mythology. And again, all of these are looking at these topics through the lens of the Bible. And then I also have a new ancient Near East civilization program, and then I've got a Mediterranean civilization program. Of course, these are both geographical regions of the larger biblical world. So it's a chance for folks to take a deep dive, and developing the curricula for those have been the bulk of what I've been doing. Finishing up a couple of books, the Göbekli Tepe in the Bible, title that Defender Publishing is going to be putting out. I've also got a forthcoming book called The Van Helsing Way, which expands on a lot of the material that I cover in the preternatural morphology class. So yeah, there's a lot of moving and shaking going on right now, and now is a really good time for people to tune in and try this stuff too, because the prices are basically as low as they've ever been, and they won't stay that way. I'll just say that much for right now.
Nice.
Because those platforms are they're gonna expand. I'm about to put in a new interactive platform that people can be more interactive with, and I'll have more lectures up and stuff like that. So that involves more work and more overhead. So just by virtue of the development, the course process, can't really stay, at the sale prices I've been giving them, but they are pretty low right now. And so if folks want to dip that toe in, then now's the time.
Excellent. One of those courses that you have is on the Apocrypha. Yeah.
Yes, there's a course in the biblical anthropology program on the Apocrypha. Yes.
Yeah, and that's going to be the subject of our conversation today. So just kind of, can you introduce us to that for some, particularly, like Protestants who've maybe kind of heard of that, maybe think it's evil or something,
Yeah.
What is the Apocrypha? And also, what role did the Septuagint play, or does the Septuagint play in its story?
Well, as to the first question, most people's familiarity with the Apocrypha, at least on the Protestant end, I know this is how it was for me, was, your Catholic friend shows you their Bible, and there are these books in there that aren't in yours, and you're like, what is this Tobit and Maccabee stuff and Bel and the Dragon? What is this, man? But Apocrypha simply mean it differs from tradition. There's Protestant Apocrypha, there's Catholic, there's Eastern Orthodox. It's just sort of all over the map. It depends on who you talk to.
Yeah.
Apocrypha is sort of a generalized term for non-canon material. And that I say generalized because it's exceedingly broad. I mean, it encompasses not only a lot of the material that people will be familiar with probably on your channel, is your podcast rather, that would be like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenic literature, which is from the Second Temple period. At least the original stuff. Now, there's older stuff in there, like the Old Testament books, like Daniel and Nehemiah, and there's a whole laundry list of them that we have either complete or fragmentary. And then there's the original stuff that the Essenes themselves wrote. That's example of Jewish Apocrypha.
That would be like the War Scroll.
Say again?
That would be like the War Scroll.
The whole laundry list of things that fall under the umbrella of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Enoch stuff, the Book of Giants, the Genesis Apocryphon, all the teacher literature in there, all of that qualifies. And of course, even early Christianity had its stuff that was sort of outside of the the so-called Irenaean canon that had been circulating long before the Council of Nicaea met, and in the years ensuing, when Constantine had his council of bishops and said, hey, print me up 50 copies of the Bible, tell me what books go in there, basically. Well, wasn't a whole lot of legwork to do by that time, because they were already working off of the aforementioned church fathers' list of inspired books, and plus the Septuagint was already in place as the Old Testament. But there were other things like the infancy Gospels, the Gospel of Mary. There's the Nag Hammadi stuff, the Gnostic Gospels, which make up an entirely different kind of Apocrypha, which Orthodox Christianity would have considered heretical, and rightly so.
Yeah.
But all of this literature that we're talking about, generally qualifies as Apocrypha. Now, as to your second question, what role does the Septuagint play in all of this? Well, it's interesting that while a lot of the original stuff amongst the Essene communities, particularly at Qumran, is being compiled and generated during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. In Alexandria, Egypt, you have this group of 70 Hellenized Jews who are translating the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, into Greek to reach a wider audience. And we even find some of this material, some of the Septuagint material has been found amongst some of the Dead Sea Scroll material. It's usually pretty fragmentary, but it's there and present. So you've got two interesting things going here. You've got literature that's not necessarily inspired canon, but it's informed. It's certainly informed, and we know that there are New Testament authors and even Old Testament authors that reference these traditions. People will probably be in some capacity familiar with the book of Jude, which takes a lot from Enoch.
Yep. Assumption
as
of
does
Moses.
right, as do a few passages in 2 Peter as well. So the fact that these guys are referencing this material doesn't make it canon, but it does make it important. It does make it theologically informative. And so, the Septuagint becomes an important text for later generations too. Not just because it's the Bible that the first century Christians are using. I mean, the New Testament hasn't, for the most part, hasn't been written yet.
Yeah.
And so this is the Bible that they're using in the Greek-speaking world. The Septuagint and let's just say the Second Temple period stuff, the Dead Sea Scroll material, is also important because both of those texts and the books contained in them are important for better understanding not just that period in history, but also earlier periods in the narrative of the Old Testament. And the big example there is that for the longest time, the oldest copies of the Old Testament, our Old Testament material that we had were Masoretic texts that dated from like the 12th and 13th century.
AD.
Yeah, AD. We're not talking BI. Absolutely.
Yeah.
These are from medieval scribes had inherited and compiled these, and so we actually have, and you can see some differences certainly between those and these older traditions that we have that represent the older traditions of Judaism, which in turn influenced the development of early Christianity. I think that George Nicholsburg has done a really good job of illustrating what some of those influences were and I've outlined some of them already. But he's written a number of papers and a couple of books on the subject. So I would highly recommend Nicholsburg to anybody who's looking to really delve more deeply into some of these connections we're teasing out today.
Well, that's great, man. So you kind of hit on this already. Like there are different like versions of the Apocrypha with the Catholic, with the Eastern Orthodox, the Protestant Apocrypha. What are some of the generally accepted books that would span those three denominational versions, I guess?
Well, there again, I mean, a lot of it is dependent on who's doing the accepting and who's doing the rejecting, which is implicit in your query.
Yeah.
But I think the connective tissue here, although it's not Apocrypha, it would definitely be the Old Testament material contained in the Dead Sea Scroll caches. But I think that a case can certainly be made for the Enochic material also having broad application. And of course, historically, stuff like Tobin and especially Maccabees, covers this period that we're talking about now, this, some things that are happening during the Second Temple period, particularly towards the middle and the later era, dealing a lot with the Seleucid occupation of the Levant at the time. And so, even though Protestants and, let's say Eastern Orthodox in general don't accept them as canon, they can accept the historicity of the events, the narrative that you find in those works. And certainly all three of the general traditions that you reference are going to acknowledge the importance of the Essenes, because we know that they were a historical entity, that they minimally interacted. They certainly separated themselves from the temple bureaucracy. That was the whole reason for the formation of the Essenes in the first place, is that they had become so disenchanted with the corruption in the temple bureaucracy that they left. And so just the acknowledgement of the historical presence of the Essenes and their intellectual tradition and theological tradition is at the very least going to be acknowledged by each one of those traditions, even if they don't accept them outright as canon or for that matter, Apocrypha.
So the Septuagint is written, at least begun to be written around 250 BC, I believe. Yeah,
mid to late 3rd century BC into the 2nd century.
Yeah, and so like I've heard many times in my life from pulpits that God was silent from Malachi on, at least until John the Baptist.
Right. I'm right there with you.
Do you
I
believe
got those sermons? No, I don't believe that, but I got those sermons.
Yeah. So you don't believe that? Why not?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest the biggest case to be made there for him not being silent are the two caches of documents that we just have been talking about, the Dead Sea Scroll cache and the Septuagint. Just because there's not any canonical scripture going on there, there's still prophecy being fulfilled, for one thing. That is the sort of procession of empires that's predicted in Daniel is being fulfilled during that period. So I would hardly call prophecy being fulfilled God being silent, as it were. But the presence of the Essenes, I think, is important here, because so much of what they talk about, the very phraseology that they use in their original literature, their apocalyptic bent, they were forward-looking for the Messiah, as all the Jews were, but they had a particular, peculiar is probably the right word. It's peculiar to them what's interesting is that by the time you get to the end of this quiet period, so-called quiet period,
Yeah.
When John the Baptist shows up on the scene, people like me and Josh Peck are convinced that he at least spent time with the Essenes, because so much of his mannerisms, the austerity of his dress, but especially the phraseology that he uses about the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and phrases like the Son of Man. These you find again and again and again in the literature of the Essenes, and of course Jesus, echoed, a lot of that kind of phraseology too.
Like you are sons of light.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you get a lot of that sort of teased out in John, who's using these sort of dualistic elements to illustrate the gospel.
Yeah.
I suspect that that's got some Essenic connections as well. And although Josh has articulated it in his, videos and documentaries and a forthcoming book, it's something that I've thought for a long time, that the Essenes didn't just drop off of the map. I think that a lot of them found their Messiah in Jesus, and once many of them heard the message, that was all they needed to hear. And, I ran into a lot of these early Jewish Christian communities while I was doing my dissertation research on Bonius. The Elkosites and the Ebionites are referenced in other literature as being connected to the Essenes, and these are some of these early Jewish Christian communities. The Nazareans were another group, and so that's long been my suspicion. I just think that Josh has really done a good job of articulating that. He's not alone, but I think he's done a really good job of articulating that. And so, looking at it longitudinally, beyond the interbiblical period, the Second Temple period, I think it's hard to say that God was silent, at that time, that he wasn't still working. I think he was certainly speaking to the hearts of men during this time, even if inspired scripture is not being written. You've got a lot of material that is referenced by the authors of inspired scripture being compiled and written during this time. And I think that's very significant, because this literature, especially the Enoch material, Jasher, Jubilees, the Genesis Apocryphon, all of this stuff was oral tradition before it was written down, just like the Torah was oral before it was ever written down, because the Hebrews don't have a written language until about the 11th or 10th century BC. And they already had the mechanisms in place to preserve the accuracy of the law that was handed down, the message that was handed down to them. And the same can be said for this stuff that finally is getting written down by the Essenes in the Second Temple period, that's so informative of, in the case of the Enoch material, the world of Genesis and the antediluvian world, but also it's forward-looking like other original Essene material, or not original because it was an oral tradition initially, but it's forward-looking and apocalyptic like a lot of their other stuff is. It clearly states that this book is written for a generation that's not yet come on the earth.
Yeah.
So there's significant commentary being written on Scripture, and the Essenes may not have even known that that's what was happening at the time. They just knew that they had to do it, that they had to compile and collate all this stuff. And of course, the Second Temple period Jews that followed Jesus, that became his disciples, not just the 12 disciples, but the broader scope of his disciples that he followed, they would have all been familiar in some capacity with this material. That's why from my research, that's why the Caesarea Philippi Peneus episode is so important, because so much of that harkens back to this Second Temple period literature. And all of the disciples, must have been mouth agape, as he was saying all this stuff, and the location that he chose to say it in. And so, it's I haven't heard a sermon like that in a long time where people are, but I think a lot of it has to do with because we know more about that period now than we did even a generation ago. But I can remember specifically sitting in the Southern Baptist church that I grew up in, in those pews, listening to preachers, talk about how, and then God was silent for 300 years. But that's not really accurate. I don't think that's accurate at all. And I think a lot of it is because we know more about that period now than we did even a generation ago.
Yeah, that's good, man. Well, kind of piggybacking on what you're saying, I'd like to discuss some of those apocryphal books in terms of the way that they helped shape early Christian theology. Like one thing that is coming to my mind is this passage from Sirach 7:14 that I mean, it's just my contention that Jesus is kind of borrowing from that in the Sermon on the Mount. Like it says, it says like, do not babble in the assembly of the elders, and don't repeat yourself when you pray. That sounds a little bit like, and when you're praying, don't use meaningless repetitions as the Gentiles do, that kind of a thing. And I think Paul in Romans 1 is kind of dipping into some Wisdom 13:1 about, Wisdom 13:1 says, for all the people who are ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they who are unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists. So it's like, Paul saying, we see God in nature, that kind of a theme. And so we're without excuse. So like, what are some other areas where you see early Christian theology maybe being shaped or influenced perhaps by some of the apocryphal literature?
Well, I think that, and this gets into some tricky territory for some people, but, as clearly Jesus and John, would have spent a lot of time together. They were family. And however Jesus came to realize who he was, what he was made for, whether it was, snap of a finger kind of a thing when he turned 13 and they had his bar mitzvah, or, I tend to think that it culminated, when he was baptized, that if there were any pieces left to that realization, that it was then. Clearly he had some indication of it. We get pieces of that, like the visit to the temple, just before his bar mitzvah, when he's talking to the elders with authority. Clearly, that process was already in play at that time. But ultimately that's kind of peripheral to what I'm saying. But that through the people that God the Father put in Jesus's life, including John the Baptist, this was a kind of tutelage, an exposure to the things that Jesus needed to know. And again, this is tricky territory for some people. I can hear the critics now, well, Dr. Burton's taken away from, the omniscience of Jesus. No, I'm not. I'm just, I don't understand the process, whether it was instant or gradual.
Yeah,
it happened. However it did. Yeah. But you can't take culture and relationship and kinship out of the equation, because it's part of the narrative. Yeah. And because John spent time, clearly in my mind, spent time with the Essenes, it was God's plan all along for this kind of phraseology and message to come out in the gospel, with John setting the stage to begin with, and then Jesus, of course, delivering the ultimate message. would baptism even have been, baptizo, the immersion, would that have even been part of not the salvific process, but the testimonial of a person's faith, had it not been for that practice of ritual bathing that the Essenes took part in, that John would have been exposed to?
Yeah.
That was made part of the testimony that believers give. That's why they, another thing I heard growing up, again and again, was believers' baptism. That it's this, and that's the theologically sound thing. There is that it is a testimony. It represents the, going under the water. It represents the death and then the ascension,
Right.
because of salvation. And so, I think that's the legitimate historical question to ask, not just a theological, but a historical question. Is, would that have even been part of the message? Now, clearly, it would have been, but for the argument's sake, would it have even been part of the message had there not been this chain of exposure and relation with John and the Essenes, and then with John and Jesus? So, clearly, there's some connective tissue there theologically. And again, you're hard pressed to find anything theologically anathema to the message of Jesus, or the Bible in general, for that matter, amongst the Dead Sea Scroll material. There's, I'm harping on Enoch because it's so well known. It's probably the most well known, and certainly the most controversial.
Yeah.
It seems like these days, but it has so much that directly impacts the Judeo-Christian thought and theology, in terms of its exposition of the antediluvian world, but also in terms of its expectations for the future, its prophetic, prognosticative stance, if you will.
Can you give an example of that? Because, like, in my assessment, that aspect is not as well hit on as it is Enoch's exposition of what happened, in the days of Jared. So can you talk a little bit about the eschatological aspect of Enoch?
Yeah, well, there are whole sections, that are devoted to that thing, and the probably the most important of them is the one that I've referenced the most in our discussion today, and that's the one that the book was not made for, the generation that it was compiled in. I mean, it edified the generation, obviously. It informed the generation, but it's very clear about, a future generation will find, I guess the best way to say it would be the most use in terms of prophetic fulfillment. And, for the longest time, our not just for not just the sections of Enoch that deal with the antediluvian world, but all of it. Some of the I suppose the less rock and roll sections of it, have been in fragments all around the world. Of course, the Ethiopic version of it has probably stayed the most intact, but in terms of having that Hebrew connection, that linguistic connection, we had to wait until 1947 for the discovery. I mean, that's just the discovery of the scrolls, and then all the work, all the paleography, all the translation, all the preservation, that the catalog, all of that stuff came later, and it was years before you had translations of the first stuff. And we're still getting, fragments and translations of stuff. So it's kind of an ongoing process. But it's clear in my mind that the generation that they're talking about, because of this this nexus of events that happened in the 20th century is probably our generation. You know, you add onto that other significant events that take place, you know, in that time window. 1948, Israel becomes a nation again that following year. Those tumblers, you know, like tumblers in a lock falling into place, to me harken back to what those forward-looking passages are talking about in Enoch. And of course, they're in Essenic literature in general, you know, they're looking for the Son of Man, they're looking for the Messiah, and they, you know, like I say, my supposition in Josh's theory is that they found that in Jesus, and that shouldn't be, again, when you look at all the similarities and the use of phraseology and the practices of John the Baptist and Jesus, that shouldn't be a huge surprise to people that they recognize. Whereas other Jewish schools of thought, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, clearly didn't. They rejected Christ. Obviously, they rejected Christ outright. But to my mind, that seems to be some of the most important forward-looking material in the Essenic literature. And you know, quite frankly, I think it's speaking about our time. I think this is a time that it's becoming of most use, because we're starting to see things happen in the scientific world, particularly that was really, you know, we haven't heard about really since antiquity. You know, now we can actually create chimera and hybrids. Probably have been able to do that for decades, but with certainty, you know, now it can be done. And any combination of animal and human DNA seems to be, you know, easily splashed together these days. And it, you know, for he who hath an ear to hear, this stuff looks a lot like what you read about in First Enoch.
Yeah. So with so many connections from this Essenic literature and the apocryphal literature to the New Testament thought, why do you think, or how did some of these books like work their way out of what was considered canon? Kind of like, you know, Enoch was considered that way until, you know, a little bit after the beginning of the 3rd century. Well, like one of the things that I've seen in early Christian literature from like Justin Martyr and Origen, like they talk about, well, Justin talks about how some of these books, kind of like Wisdom chapter 2, which is kind of like like if Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22 had a baby. That's like what Wisdom 22 is. That's Wisdom chapter 2.
That's a good description.
Yeah.
That's a good description.
Thanks. Well, he's like, you know, and a lot of these books that show that the Messiah would be crucified or murdered and that he would be God and man, the Jewish leaders were trying to take away. And then like Origen talks about, he gives the connection to Susanna about, you know, these two leaders in the Jewish community of Babylon who tried to have sex with Susanna, and then she didn't want to, so they, you know, create this false trial, or these false accusations to get her killed, and they end up being killed. And so Origen is basically saying that the Jewish leadership of his day have tried to remove any of those apocalyptic writings that showed Jewish leadership to be corrupt. Sorry for that long-winded explanation.
No.
But that would kind of go along with Justin's too, since the Messiah was crucified by, you know, or the Jewish part. But what do you, how do you see the apocryphal literature? Why did it start working its way out of common
Well,
practice.
you very astutely point out that the church fathers, the patristics, reference this material all the time. I mean, you're hard pressed to find. I mean, you go down the laundry list: Clement, Irenaeus, Origen, Tertullian, Justin Martyr, who you mentioned. They all talk about it. Some more than others, but they find valuable or they find teaching value, I should say. Certainly in this apocryphal literature, because it informed. And they knew that it informed, the New Testament. They could. Whereas we lost for centuries. Well, we lost for centuries. They could read Mark chapter 8 or Matthew chapter 16 when Jesus is at the foot of Mount Hermon, and like, oh yeah, clearly he's doing X, Y, and Z. He's firing a shot over the enemy bow.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how this material becomes so peripheral. And not that these guys maybe even equated it with canon. I don't think that they did. I think that most of them believed that, they believed in the Spirit inspired canon that had been demonstrated by the surest authorship. I mean, that was really one of the qualifying elements was certainty of authorship. But they recognized that this other stuff was theologically relevant, historically relevant, and good for teaching. But as you point out, that begins to change, particularly in the 4th century AD and 5th century AD. And it's not that you can, I mean, you can't really lay all of the blame on the ecumenical councils. There's so much going on there. And even the canon of the Bible that we mentioned a moment ago had largely been configured.
Yeah.
And so the bishops that Constantine, convenes in it's 331. It's actually 6 years after the Council of Nicaea. They didn't really have much work to do other than to just, get the books, made, the codices made, and then printed out. But it's when and this is what's always kind of been interesting to me, is that you begin to see a lot of church fathers from the West, from the Latin West, weighing in on this stuff and then kind of poo-pooing it. And this is where we get the Sethite connection amongst thinkers like Julius Africanus, and especially Augustine of Hippo.
Yep.
And
even Africanus is saying, this is just my opinion because it's
mostly
taught the traditional way everywhere else.
Exactly. But it's interesting that the critique and the outright, rejection comes from the Latin West. It's in the Greek East where, these ideas are still kind of hanging on, actually to an extent. And later generations, whether you're talking about the Roman Catholic Church or the Proto-Protestant and then the Protestant Reformation. I say Proto-Protestant because there were Protestant-minded thinkers, as you well know, before before the actual Protestant Reformation with Luther. But a lot of these guys were big fans of Augustine, including Luther.
Oh yeah.
The big the big thinkers in medieval Roman Catholicism, like Thomas Aquinas. He was a big devotee of Augustine's work, and Luther found merit with both of them.
Calvin,
and so,
of course.
Yeah, Calvin. Zwingli, all these guys, were, in one shape or another influenced by Augustinian thought.
Yeah.
And that carried with it the subscription to the Sethite view. And as both, at first as Roman Catholicism spread, and then as the Protestant movement spread, and then you have the Counter Reformation, which is sort of the blowback from the Protestant Reformation. It's just like dropping pebbles, in a pond. They cross each other and they become more prolific, and that's how these ideas about the Sethite view become so entrenched in Western theology. So there's a clear, historical lineage, where we can trace this back to, and it starts in the Latin West, really in the days just before the establishment of the Roman Catholic Church.
That's good stuff. Well, dude, I really appreciate you coming on. Anytime you want to come on, this would be great.
I'm honored. Yeah, I live for this stuff.
Yeah, man. So just last question: if there's someone listening who's never read any of the apocryphal books, what advice would you give them, and where do you think they should start?
I would have them listen to this podcast. Actually, no, I would say, think of the Second Temple period when all this literature is being either compiled or produced, as God not being silent, but speaking, more directed. He's choosing who he's going to speak to rather than a general audience. The general stuff comes later.
Yeah.
But if you had, if you're not sure about it, if you're bothered by it not being canon, I understand that. But you have to understand that there are authors of biblical books, canon books, like Jude, like Peter, who reference this material. And so if God inspired them to write these books, and you believe that, then you also have to believe that God inspired them to reference the apocryphal material that they're using. So, I think probably the best, place to start is, actually getting and there are a number of them on the market that are good, but get a Dead Sea Scroll library. Get this stuff from the Hebrew tradition, and just go through and look at how many books of the Old Testament are preserved in this stuff, and then start diving into Enoch and the Genesis Apocrypha and some of the original literature that the Essenes wrote. Look at start looking for that phraseology, that John the Baptist used and that Jesus would later use. And you'll see how important this stuff really is to better understanding the Bible and its message.
That's awesome. Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is go take Dr. Burton's course if you're listening.
Right, do that too.
Yeah.
In fact, that's a great way to dip your toe into the Apocrypha, because you get a little bit of everything in that class.
Farewell to friends and family.